to 11 disciples and others in Luke 24, verses 33 through 49, to 10 apostles and others, with Thomas absent, in John 20, verses 19 through 23, to Thomas and the other apostles in John 20, verses 26 through 30, to 7 apostles in John 21, verses 1 through 14, to the disciples in Matthew 28, verses 16 through 20, and he was with the apostles at the Mount of Olives before his ascension in Luke 24, verses 50 through 52, and Acts 1, verses 4 through 9. It's particularly interesting, Habermas added, that C.H. Dodd, the Cambridge University scholar, has carefully analyzed these appearances and concluded that several of them are based on especially early material, including Jesus' encounter with the women in Matthew 28, verses 8 through 10, his meeting with the 11 apostles, in which he gave them the Great Commission in Matthew 28, verses 16 through 20, and his meeting with the disciples in John 20, verses 19 through 23, in which he showed them his hands and side. Again, here was a wealth of sightings of Jesus. This was not merely a fleeting observance of a shadowy figure by one or two people. There were multiple appearances to numerous people, several of the appearances being confirmed in more than one gospel or by the 1 Corinthians 15 creed. Is there any further corroboration, I asked? Just look at Acts, replied Habermas, referring to the New Testament book that records the launch of the church. Not only are Jesus' appearances mentioned regularly, but details are provided, and the theme of the disciples being a witness of these things is found in almost every context. The key, Habermas said, is that a number of the accounts in Acts 1 through 5, 10, and 13 also include some creeds that, like the one in 1 Corinthians 15, report some very early data concerning the death and resurrection of Jesus. With that, Habermas picked up a book and read the conclusion of scholar John Drain. The earliest evidence we have for the resurrection almost certainly goes back to the time immediately after the resurrection event is alleged to have taken place. This is the evidence contained in the early sermons in the Acts of the Apostles. There can be no doubt that in the first few chapters of Acts, its author has preserved material from very early sources. Indeed, Acts is littered with references to Jesus' appearances. The Apostle Peter was especially adamant about it. He says in Acts 2, verse 32, God has raised this Jesus to life, and we are all witnesses of it. In Acts 3, verse 15, he repeats, you killed the author of life, but God raised him from the dead. We are witnesses of this. He confirms to Cornelius in Acts 10, verse 41, that he and others ate and drank with him after he rose from the dead. Not to be outdone, Paul said in a speech recorded in Acts 13, verse 31, for many days he was seen by those who had traveled with him from Galilee to Jerusalem. They are now his witnesses to our people. Asserted Habermas, the resurrection was undoubtedly the central proclamation of the early church from the very beginning. The earliest Christians didn't just endorse Jesus' teachings. They were convinced they had seen him alive after his crucifixion. That's what changed their lives and started the church. Certainly, since this was their centermost conviction, they would have made absolutely sure that it was true. All of the gospel and Acts evidence, incident after incident, witness after witness, detail after detail, corroboration on top of corroboration, was extremely impressive. Although I tried, I couldn't think of any more thoroughly attested event in ancient history. However, there was another question that needed to be raised. This one concerning the gospel that most scholars believe was the first account of Jesus to be written. When I first began investigating the resurrection, I encountered a troubling comment in the margin of my Bible. The most reliable early manuscripts and other ancient witnesses do not have Mark 16, verses 9 through 20. In other words, most scholars believe that the Gospel of Mark ends at chapter 16, verse 8, with the women discovering the tomb empty, but without Jesus having appeared alive to anyone at all. That seemed perplexing. Doesn't it bother you that the earliest gospel doesn't even report any post-resurrection appearances? I asked Habermas. On the contrary, he didn't seem disturbed at all. I don't have a problem with that whatsoever, he said. Sure, it would be nice if he had included a list of appearances, but here are some things for you to think about. Even if Mark does end there, which not everyone believes, you still have him reporting that the tomb is empty, and a young man proclaiming he is risen, and telling the women that there will be appearances. So you have, first, a proclamation that the resurrection has occurred, and second, a prediction that appearances will follow. You can close your favorite novel and say, I can't believe the author's not telling me the next episode. But you can't close the book and say, the writer doesn't believe in the next episode. Mark definitely does. He obviously believed the resurrection had taken place. He ends with the women being told that Jesus will appear in Galilee, and then others later confirm that he did. According to church tradition, Mark was a companion of the eyewitness Peter. Isn't it odd, I asked, that Mark wouldn't mention that Jesus appeared to Peter if he really had? Mark doesn't mention any appearances, so it wouldn't be peculiar that Peter isn't listed, he said. However, note that Mark does single out Peter. Mark 16, verse 7 says, But go, tell his disciples and Peter, he is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you. This agrees with 1 Corinthians 15, verse 5, which confirms that Jesus did appear to Peter, and Luke 24, verse 34, another early creed, which says, It is true, the Lord has risen and has appeared to Simon, or Peter. So what Mark predicts about Peter is reported to have been fulfilled in two early and very reliable creeds of the church, as well as by Peter himself in Acts. Without question, the amount of testimony and corroboration of Jesus' post-resurrection appearances is staggering. To put it into perspective, if you were to call each of the witnesses to a court of law to be cross-examined for just 15 minutes each, and you went around the clock without a break, it would take you from breakfast on Monday until dinner on Friday to hear them all. After listening to 129 straight hours of eyewitness testimony, who could possibly walk away unconvinced? Having been a legal affairs journalist who has covered scores of trials, both criminal and civil, I had to agree with the assessment of Sir Edward Clarke, a British High Court judge who conducted a thorough legal analysis of the first Easter. To me, the evidence is conclusive, and over again in the High Court, I have secured the verdict on evidence not nearly so compelling. As a lawyer, I accept the gospel evidence unreservedly as the testimony of truthful men to facts that they were able to substantiate. However, could there be any plausible alternatives that could explain away these encounters with the risen Jesus? Could these accounts be legendary in nature? Or might the witnesses have experienced hallucinations? I decided to raise those issues with Habermas to get his response. Possibility 1. The appearances are legendary. If it's true that the Gospel of Mark originally ended before any appearances were reported, it could be argued that there's evolutionary development in the Gospels. Mark records no appearances, Matthew has some, Luke has more, and John has the most. Doesn't that demonstrate that the appearances are merely legends that grew up over time? I asked. For a lot of reasons, no, it doesn't, Habermas assured me. First, not everyone believes Mark is the earliest gospel. There are scholars, admittedly in the minority, who believe Matthew was written first. Second, even if I accept your premise as true, it only proves that legends grow up over time. It can't explain away the original belief that Jesus was risen from the dead. Something happened that prompted the apostles to make the resurrection the central proclamation of the earliest church. Legend can't explain those initial eyewitness accounts. In other words, legend can tell you how a story got bigger. It can't tell you how it originated when the participants are both eyewitnesses and reported the events early. Third, you're forgetting that the 1 Corinthians 15 creed predates any of the Gospels, and it makes huge claims about the appearances. In fact, the claim involving the biggest number, that he was seen alive by 500 people at once, goes back to this earliest source. That creates problems for the legendary development theory. The best reasons for rejecting the legend theory come from the early creedal accounts in 1 Corinthians 15 and Acts, both of which predate the gospel material. And fourth, what about the empty tomb? If the resurrection were merely a legend, the tomb would be filled. However, it was empty on Easter morning. That demands an additional hypothesis. Possibility 2. The appearances were hallucinations. Maybe the witnesses were sincere in believing they saw Jesus. Perhaps they accurately recorded what took place. But could they have been seeing a hallucination that convinced them that they were encountering Jesus when they really weren't? Habermas smiled at the question. "Do you know Gary Collins?" he asked. The question took me off guard. "Sure," I replied. "I know him. I was in his office just recently to interview him for this same book," I said. "Do you believe he's qualified as a psychologist?" Habermas asked. "Yes," I answered warily, since I could tell he was setting me up for something. "A doctorate, a professor for 20 years, the author of dozens of books on psychological issues, president of a national association of psychologists? Yeah, sure, I'd consider him qualified." Habermas handed me a piece of paper. I asked Gary about the possibility that these were hallucinations, and this is his professional opinion, he told me. I looked at the document. Hallucinations are individual occurrences. By their very nature, only one person can see a given hallucination at a time. They certainly aren't something which can be seen by a group of people. Neither is it possible that one person could somehow induce an hallucination in someone else. Since an hallucination exists only in this subjective, personal sense, it is obvious that others cannot witness it. That, said Habermas, is a big problem for the hallucination theory, since there are repeated accounts of Jesus appearing to multiple people who reported the same thing. And there are several other arguments why hallucinations can't explain away his appearances, he continued. The disciples were fearful, doubtful, and in despair after his crucifixion, whereas people who hallucinate need a fertile mind of expectancy or anticipation. Peter was hard-headed, for goodness sake. James was a skeptic, certainly not good candidates for hallucinations. Also, hallucinations are comparably rare. They're usually caused by drugs or bodily deprivation. Chances are you don't know anybody who's ever had a hallucination not caused by one of those two things. Yet we're supposed to believe that over a course of many weeks, people from all sorts of backgrounds, all kinds of temperaments, in various places, all experience hallucinations? That strains the hypothesis quite a bit, doesn't it? Besides, if we establish the gospel accounts as being reliable, how do you account for the disciples eating with Jesus and touching him? How does he walk along with two of them on the road to Emmaus? And what about the empty tomb? If people only thought they saw Jesus, his body would still be in his grave. Okay, I thought, if it wasn't a hallucination, maybe it was something more subtle. Could this have been an example of groupthink, in which people talk each other into seeing something that doesn't exist? I asked. As Michael Martin observed, a person full of religious zeal may see what he or she wants to see, not what is really there. Habermas laughed. You know, one of the atheists I debated, Anthony Flew, told me he doesn't like it when other atheists use that last argument, because it cuts both ways. As Flew said, Christians believe because they want to, but atheists don't believe because they don't want to. Actually, there are several reasons why the disciples couldn't have talked each other into this. At the center of their faith, there was too much at stake. Wouldn't some of them rethink the groupthink at a later date and recant or just quietly fall away? And what about James, who didn't believe in Jesus, and Paul, who was a persecutor of Christians? How did they get talked into seeing something? Further, what about the empty tomb? And on top of that, this view doesn't account for the forthright language of sight in the 1 Corinthians 15 creed and other passages. The eyewitnesses were at least convinced that they had seen Jesus alive, and groupthink doesn't explain that aspect very well. Habermas paused long enough to pull out a book and cap his argument with a quote from prominent theologian and historian Karl Brayton. Even the more skeptical historians agree that for primitive Christianity, the resurrection of Jesus from the dead was a real event in history, the very foundation of faith, and not a mythical idea arising out of the creative imagination of believers. Sometimes, concluded Habermas, people just grasp at straws trying to account for the appearances. But nothing fits all of the evidence better than the explanation that Jesus was alive. Jesus was killed on the cross. Alexander Metherell had made that graphically clear. His tomb was empty on Easter morning. William Lane Craig left no doubt about that. His disciples and others saw him, touched him, and ate with him after the resurrection. Gary Habermas has built that case with abundant evidence. As prominent British theologian Michael Green said, the appearances of Jesus are as well authenticated as anything in antiquity. There can be no rational doubt that they occurred, and that the main reason why Christianity became sure of the resurrection in the earliest days was just this. They could say with assurance, "We have seen the Lord." They knew it was He. And all this doesn't even exhaust the evidence. I had already made plane reservations for a trip to the other side of the country to interview one more expert on the final category of proof that the resurrection is a real event of history. Before I left Habermas's office, however, I had one more question. Frankly, I hesitated to ask it because it was a bit too predictable, and I thought I'd get an answer that was a little too pat. The question concerned the importance of the resurrection. I figured if I asked Habermas about that, he'd give the standard reply about it being at the center of Christian doctrine, the axis around which the Christian faith turned. And I was right. He did give a stock answer like that. But what surprised me was that this wasn't all he said. This nuts and bolts scholar, this burly and straight-shooting debater, this combat-ready defender of the faith, allowed me to peer into his soul as he gave an answer that grew out of the deepest valley of despair he had ever walked through. Habermas rubbed his graying beard. The quick-fire cadence and debater's edge to his voice were gone. No more quoting of scholars, no more citing of Scripture, no more building a case. I had asked about the importance of the resurrection, and Habermas decided to take a risk by hearkening back to 1995, when his wife Debbie slowly died of stomach cancer. Caught off guard by the tenderness of the moment, all I could do was listen. I sat on our porch, he began, looking off to the side at nothing in particular. He sighed deeply, then went on. My wife was upstairs, dying. Except for a few weeks, she was home through it all. It was an awful time. This was the worst thing that could possibly happen. He turned and looked straight at me. But do you know what was amazing? My students would call me, not just one, but several of them, and say, at a time like this, aren't you glad about the resurrection? As sober as those circumstances were, I had to smile for two reasons. First, my students were trying to cheer me up with my own teaching. And second, it worked. As I would sit there, I'd picture Job, who went through all that terrible stuff and asked questions of God, but then God turned the tables and asked him a few questions. I knew if God were to come to me, I'd ask only one question. Lord, why is Debbie up there in bed? And I think God would respond by asking gently, Gary, did I raise my son from the dead? I'd say, come on, Lord. I've written 7 books on that topic. Of course he was raised from the dead. But I want to know about Debbie. I think he'd keep coming back to that same question. Did I raise my son from the dead? Did I raise my son from the dead? Until I got his point. The resurrection says, if Jesus was raised 2,000 years ago, there's an answer to Debbie's death in 1995. And you know what? It worked for me while I was sitting on the porch, and it still works today. It was a horribly emotional time for me, but I couldn't get around the fact that the resurrection is the answer for her suffering. I still worried. I still wondered what I'd do raising 4 kids alone. But there wasn't a time when that truth didn't comfort me. Losing my wife was the most painful experience I've ever had to face. But if the resurrection could get me through that, it can get me through anything. It was good for AD 30. It's good for 1995. It's good for 1998. And it's good beyond that. Habermas locked eyes with mine. That's not some sermon, he said quietly. I believe that with all my heart. If there's a resurrection, there's a heaven. If Jesus was raised, Debbie will be raised. And I will be someday too. Then I'll see them both.